What if the person you trusted most had a secret so shocking it could destroy everything? A surprise retirement party meant to celebrate decades of dedication takes a dark and unexpected turn when a double life is exposed in front of everyone. But that's just the beginning. By the end of the night, betrayal, obsession, and revenge will collide in a way no one saw coming. You won't believe how this story unfolds. The banquet hall buzzed with excitement as guests gathered to celebrate Dr. Richard Grant's illustrious career. The room was a mix of warm laughter, clinking glasses, and heartfelt toasts from family and colleagues. Laura Grant, Richard's wife, stood proudly by his side, her smile bright and unwavering. She had spent weeks planning this surprise retirement party, a gesture she believed would show her love and admiration for the man she had spent 3 decades with. Richard, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, appeared every bit the accomplished doctor and loving family man. Yet, beneath the confident exterior, his eyes darted to the entrance more often than seemed necessary. Laura noticed, but dismissed it as nervous energy. After all, he wasn't the type to enjoy being the center of attention. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder and whispered, "You deserve this, Richard. Enjoy it." He nodded and gave her a tight smile, but something about his expression seemed off. The evening rolled on, with one toast after another celebrating Richard's compassion, brilliance, and dedication. His colleagues shared anecdotes about his tireless work at the hospital, and his children, Ethan and Grace, spoke about his role as a father. Laura couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This was the man she had built her life with. Yet, as the speeches continued, she noticed subtle changes in Richard's demeanor. His jaw tightened when a nurse named Emma Collins was mentioned briefly in one of the speeches. Emma, sitting quietly in a corner, clapped politely but kept her head low. Laura's mind wandered. Emma had been a familiar face at hospital events and fundraisers, always warm and professional. But lately, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that Emma was around more often than usual. She dismissed it again, chalking it up to coincidence. After all, Richard had always been respected by his colleagues, and Emma likely saw him as a mentor. But then, during dinner, Laura saw Richard's phone light up on the table beside him. A text message appeared briefly before the screen went dark. It read, "We need to talk. I can't keep this up." Laura's heart skipped a beat, and she glanced at her husband, who quickly slid the phone into his pocket, his expression unreadable. Questions swirled in her mind, but she forced herself to focus on the event. This was his night. She wouldn't let a silly text ruin it. As the evening wound down, the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. Laura stepped up to the microphone, her voice warm and filled with emotion. "Tonight, we celebrate a man who has given so much of himself to his work, his family, and his friends. Richard, you have always been my rock, and we are all so proud of you. Please come up and say a few words." The crowd erupted in applause as Richard made his way to the stage. He adjusted the microphone, his hands trembling slightly. Laura noticed the unease but smiled at him encouragingly. "Thank you," Richard began, his voice steady but lacking its usual confidence. "I'm overwhelmed by all of this, truly. To see so many people who have been part of my journey means more than I can say." He continued, thanking his colleagues and family, but his words felt rehearsed, almost mechanical. When he turned to Laura, there was a moment of hesitation. "And of course, to my wife, Laura, who has been my partner through everything. I don't know where I'd be without her." His voice faltered slightly, and the room grew quieter. Laura's smile froze as she sensed something unusual in his tone. Then, just as Richard tried to wrap up his speech, a voice broke through the silence. "That's not the whole truth, is it, Richard? The crowd turned, and all eyes fell on Emma Collins, who had stood up from her seat in the corner. Her face was pale, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. The room held its collective breath as Emma's words sliced through the air. "You didn't tell them everything, did you? About us?" Gasps rippled through the room as Richard's face turned ashen. Laura's heart pounded, her breath caught in her throat. She stared at Emma, then at Richard, searching for an explanation. "What is she talking about?" Laura whispered, her voice trembling. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Emma stepped forward, her voice louder now. "I loved you, Richard. I gave you everything. And now you're just going to pretend I never existed." The room descended into chaos. Guests whispered furiously, some too stunned to react. Laura's world shattered as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She had spent years building a life with a man she thought she knew, but now, in front of everyone, his secrets were unraveling. Laura looked at Richard, her voice rising above the commotion. "Tell me it's not true. Please, tell me it's not true." But Richard couldn't meet her eyes. His silence was all the confirmation she needed. Laura's hands trembled as anger and betrayal consumed her. She turned to Emma, her voice cold and sharp. "How long?" Emma's answer was swift and unapologetic. "Years. Longer than you'd think." The room fell into a stunned silence once more, as Laura staggered back, her mind racing. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was an entire life she had been blind to. And now, everything was spiraling out of control. The room, once filled with laughter and celebration, now felt suffocatingly tense. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to stay or leave. Richard stood frozen on stage, his confident facade crumbling under the weight of the truth. Laura, rooted in place, stared at him with a mix of disbelief and fury. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, leaving her breathless. "Answer me, Richard," Laura demanded, her voice trembling. "How could you do this? How could you lie to me for years?" Richard stumbled over his words, his tone desperate and defensive. "Laura, it's not what you think. Please, let's talk about this privately." Emma's laugh cut through his attempt to control the situation. "Not what she thinks?" she said bitterly, stepping closer to the stage. "What part of years do you think she'll misunderstand, Richard? Or should I tell her about all the times you promised you'd leave her for me?" A fresh wave of gasps spread through the room. Laura's face flushed with anger as she processed Emma's words. "You promised her what?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. "I didn't mean it," Richard blurted, his eyes darting between Laura and Emma. "I was trying to keep things under control. I didn't want to hurt anyone." "Didn't want to hurt anyone?" Emma's voice rose, raw with emotion. "You lied to her? You lied to me, and now you're trying to make yourself the victim? You're pathetic." The tension in the room was unbearable. Laura felt her legs weaken, but she forced herself to stand tall. "This isn't the time or place," she said coldly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "We'll deal with this later." But as she turned to leave, Emma's voice stopped her. "No, Laura, you deserve to know everything. I won't let him weasel his way out of this." Emma's hands trembled as she reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of papers. "He gave me these. Divorce papers, signed. He told me he was leaving you." Laura froze. Her blood ran cold as she looked at the papers Emma held up. The room erupted into chaos again, voices overlapping in shocked whispers. Richard's colleagues exchanged uncomfortable glances, while his children sat pale and silent, unable to process the scene unraveling before them. "Is that true?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to Richard, her expression a mix of heartbreak and disgust. "You were going to leave me, after everything we've been through?" Richard's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him. "I don't know what to say," he muttered. "It was complicated." Laura's composure snapped. "Complicated!" she shouted. "You destroyed our marriage, humiliated me in front of everyone we know, and you call it complicated." She stormed out of the hall, leaving Richard standing alone, the weight of his betrayal crushing him. The cold night air hit Laura like a slap as she stumbled outside. Her mind raced with questions, each one more painful than the last. How long had he been lying to her? How had she missed the signs? And how could she ever trust him again? The betrayal wasn't just about the affair. It was about the life she thought they'd built together, now revealed as a facade. Back inside, Richard faced the crowd. His colleagues and friends looked at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. "I think it's time we ended the evening," someone muttered awkwardly, and the guests began to filter out, whispering among themselves. Emma, still standing near the stage, didn't move. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. For years she had lived in Richard's shadow, believing his promises and waiting for a future that now seemed like a cruel joke. "You used me," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "All this time, you used me." Richard stepped down from the stage and approached her cautiously. "Emma, I never meant for it to end this way. I didn't know what to do." "You didn't know what to do?" Emma snapped, her voice rising again. "You lied to me, you lied to her, and now what? You think you can just walk away?" Her words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken threats. Richard glanced around nervously, realizing they were among the last people in the room. "I think you should go," he said firmly, his tone sharp. "This is getting out of hand." Emma's eyes darkened. "Out of hand?" she repeated. "You think this is over, Richard? You have no idea what I'm capable of." Before he could respond, Emma turned on her heel and stormed out of the hall. Richard watched her go, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and regret. He knew Emma wasn't bluffing. She had sacrificed too much to be cast aside like this, and he had no doubt she would make him pay. Meanwhile, Laura sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She stared into the darkness, her mind replaying Emma's words. Divorce papers, promises, lies. The betrayal churned in her stomach, transforming her heartbreak into a simmering rage. For the first time, she allowed herself to think dark thoughts. Thoughts she had always pushed away. Richard had shattered her trust, her pride, and her future. And for what? A lie? A fantasy? She clenched her jaw, her mind racing toward a dangerous conclusion. If he could destroy everything so easily, maybe he didn't deserve to keep it. The house was eerily quiet when Laura returned home. Her heels clicked against the tiled floor as she walked into the living room, her movements deliberate but unsteady. The warmth and familiarity of her home, once her sanctuary, now felt suffocating, like it was closing in around her. Everything in this space reminded her of Richard, his favorite chair, the framed family photos, the scent of his cologne lingering in the air. It all felt like a cruel mockery of the life she thought she had. Laura poured herself a glass of wine, her hands trembling as she set the bottle down. The night's events played over and over in her mind like a broken record. The public humiliation, Emma's cold confession, Richard's silence. The betrayal cut deeper every time she replayed it. She sat down on the couch, clutching the glass tightly, and stared at the empty space in front of her. Her thoughts grew darker, angrier. For years, she had sacrificed her dreams to support Richard's career. She had been the perfect wife, standing by him through long nights and endless hospital shifts. She had loved him unconditionally, and this was how he repaid her. Laura's grip on the glass tightened until it cracked, the sharp sound startling her out of her thoughts. A thin line of red streaked across her palm where the glass had cut her, but she barely noticed. She stood abruptly, her breathing uneven. The house was too quiet, too still. She needed answers. She needed to confront Richard, not the pitiful man who stammered on stage tonight, but the man who had lied to her for years. She needed to see his face, to force him to explain how he could destroy everything they had built together. Grabbing her coat, she left the house, her mind racing. Meanwhile, across town, Richard sat in a dimly lit apartment, the one he had rented in secret during his affair with Emma. It was sparsely furnished, more functional than comfortable, a reflection of the life he had built on lies. He stared at his phone, ignoring the dozens of missed calls and messages from friends and colleagues. His mind was consumed by Emma's final words. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. Emma wasn't one to make empty threats. He had seen the way she could manipulate people, the way she always got what she wanted. He knew she was furious and he couldn't blame her. But this wasn't just anger. This was something darker, something dangerous. As the hours dragged on, Richard's paranoia grew. He locked the door and double-checked the windows, his nerves fraying with every sound outside. His mind wandered to Laura, and guilt weighed heavily on him. He had destroyed her trust, humiliated her, and now she was gone too. He thought about calling her, but he didn't know what to say. What could he possibly say to fix this? A sudden knock at the door shattered the silence, and Richard jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. He hesitated, staring at the door. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky. There was no answer. The silence on the other side of the door was deafening. Richard stepped closer, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He could feel his pulse racing in his temples. "Emma?" he asked cautiously. Still no response. Gathering his courage, he unlocked the door and opened it slowly. The hallway outside was empty, the dim light casting long shadows. He stepped outside, glancing up and down the corridor, but there was no one in sight. Unease crept over him as he closed the door and locked it again, his hands trembling. He returned to the living room and sat down, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting someone to appear. The fear gnawed at him, growing stronger with each passing minute. He didn't know who to fear more, Emma, Laura, or himself. Laura's car sped through the quiet streets, her grip tight on the steering wheel. Her mind was a chaotic swirl of emotions: anger, betrayal, heartbreak. Each thought fed into the next, amplifying her fury. She didn't know where she was driving, but her instincts guided her to a place she had never intended to see. The address Emma had mentioned in passing during a hospital fundraiser suddenly surfaced in her mind, a detail she hadn't realized she'd remembered. Now, it pulled her like a magnet. She parked outside a small, nondescript apartment complex. The building looked ordinary, its windows dark and unassuming, but Laura knew this was where Emma lived. Her breathing quickened as she sat in the car, staring at the building. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to turn around, to go home, but she couldn't. Not yet. She needed closure, answers, something to make sense of the chaos her life had become. Laura stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at her skin. Her footsteps echoed as she approached the entrance. Her pulse raced, her thoughts spiraling as she climbed the stairs to Emma's apartment. When she reached the door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She hadn't planned what to say, what to do. All she knew was that she couldn't leave without confronting the woman who had shattered her life. The door creaked open suddenly, startling her. Emma stood in the doorway, her face pale but calm. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The tension crackled like electricity between them. "I knew you'd come," Emma said quietly, her voice devoid of the anger and defiance she'd shown earlier. She stepped aside, motioning for Laura to enter. Might as well say what you came to say. Laura hesitated but stepped inside. The apartment was small and sparse, with a faint scent of lavender and something metallic lingering in the air. Laura's eyes swept over the room, her heart pounding. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you do this? Why him?" Emma leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "I didn't plan for this to happen," she said flatly, "but it did. He wanted me and I believed him. He told me things, Laura, things about you, about your marriage. He made it seem like he was miserable, like you were the reason he couldn't be happy." Laura's stomach turned. "You're lying." Emma shook her head. "Am I? Or did you just never notice how unhappy he was?" The words hit Laura like a slap. Her anger flared again, burning hotter than before. "You don't get to blame me for this," she snapped. "You're the one who—" A loud crash interrupted her. Both women turned toward the noise, their eyes darting to the source. The sound had come from the bedroom. Laura's heart raced as Emma's face darkened. "Wait here," Emma said sharply, moving toward the bedroom door. Emma disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Laura standing in the living room, her chest heaving with adrenaline. The silence that followed was deafening. Seconds stretched into minutes, and Laura's nerves frayed with each passing moment. She glanced around the room, her mind racing with questions. What was that noise? Was someone else here? Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. "Emma?" she called out, her voice shaky. No answer. Laura took a cautious step toward the bedroom, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. The air felt heavier, the tension almost unbearable. "Emma?" she called again, louder this time. Still nothing. Her hand reached for the doorknob, and she hesitated, her pulse hammering in her ears. Summoning her courage, she pushed the door open slowly. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn. Emma stood frozen in the center of the room, her back to Laura. "What is it?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma didn't move. "You need to leave," she said quietly, her tone sharp and urgent. "What? Why?" "Just go, Laura," Emma snapped, finally turning to face her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. "You shouldn't be here." Before Laura could respond, she noticed something behind Emma, something on the bed. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what it was. A bloodied envelope lay on the neatly made bedspread, its stark red stain spreading across the pristine white sheets. Next to it, a knife glinted faintly in the dim light. "What? What is this?" Laura stammered, taking a step back. Emma's gaze flicked toward the bed, then back to Laura. Her expression hardened. "This is what he's done to both of us," she said cryptically. "And this is just the beginning." Laura's stomach churned as dread settled over her. She turned and fled the apartment, her heels echoing loudly against the hallway floor. Emma didn't stop her. As Laura reached her car, she gasped for air, her hands shaking violently. Something was very, very wrong. Inside the apartment, Emma locked the door and stared at the envelope and knife. Her hands trembled as she reached for them, her face a mix of fury and determination. Laura sat in her car outside the apartment complex, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she replayed the scene inside Emma's apartment. The bloodied envelope, the knife, Emma's cryptic words. They all swirled together in her mind, creating a storm of confusion and dread. She wanted to leave, to drive as far away as possible, but her hands wouldn't move. Something inside her demanded she stay, that she figure out what was really happening. As she sat frozen in place, her phone buzzed on the seat next to her. The screen lit up with Richard's name. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. She didn't want to hear his voice, didn't want to endure more lies. But curiosity and anger got the better of her. She snatched up the phone and answered, her voice sharp. "What do you want, Richard?" There was silence on the other end, followed by a deep sigh. "Laura, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low and strained. "Please, this has gotten out of control." Laura let out a bitter laugh. "Out of control? That's an understatement. Do you have any idea what I just saw at Emma's place? Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" Richard's voice wavered. "Emma's place. You went there." There was a hint of panic in his tone. "Laura, listen to me. You need to stay away from her. She's not stable." Laura's anger flared. "Not stable? That's rich coming from you, Richard. You're the one who lied, who cheated, who wrecked everything, and now you're trying to pin this on her?" "You don't understand," Richard said, his voice rising. "Emma, she's dangerous. She's not who you think she is." "And who is she, Richard?" Laura snapped. "The woman you promised to leave me for? The woman you signed divorce papers for? Or is she just another pawn in whatever twisted game you're playing?" "Laura, please," Richard said desperately. "Just come home. Let's talk about this. I'll explain everything." Laura hesitated, her mind racing. There was something in Richard's voice, fear, maybe even desperation, that gave her pause. Despite her rage, a part of her wanted to hear him out, to piece together the fragments of this nightmare. But then she remembered Emma's face, the fear in her eyes, and the bloodied envelope on the bed. Her instincts screamed that there was more to this than Richard was letting on. "I'm not coming home," Laura said finally, her voice cold. "Not until I know the truth." "Laura," Richard began, but she ended the call before he could finish. She threw the phone onto the passenger seat and stared out at the dark street, her thoughts churning. Something was unraveling, something far bigger and darker than she could have imagined, and she was caught in the middle of it. Inside Emma's apartment, Emma sat at the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she unfolded the bloodied envelope. Inside was a single photograph, creased and smeared with red. It was of her and Richard, taken years ago, smiling together in a moment of stolen happiness. Scrawled across the photo in jagged, angry letters were the words, "You'll both pay for this." Emma's heart raced as she read the words again, her fear turning to anger. She crumpled the photo in her fist, her jaw tightening. She knew who had left it, and she knew what they were trying to do, but she wasn't going to let them win. Not now, not after everything she had endured. She grabbed her coat and stormed out of the apartment, her steps purposeful and her eyes burning with determination. Tonight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The night was colder than usual, the wind cutting sharply as Emma stepped out of her apartment building. Her mind was racing, her emotions raw. She clutched her coat tightly around her, the bloodied photograph still crumpled in her pocket. The words on it echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder that her secret world with Richard was no longer private. Someone else knew, someone who wanted to destroy them both. Emma's footsteps echoed on the pavement as she walked quickly down the street, her head darting from side to side. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows seemed deeper tonight, the quiet too oppressive. She reached into her pocket and tightened her grip around the photograph, its sharp edges digging into her palm. She thought of Laura's face, the mix of fury and heartbreak that had confronted her just hours ago. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if Laura had left the photo as a warning. No, she whispered to herself, shaking her head. Laura wasn't the type. Her rage was palpable, yes, but this felt calculated, personal. Whoever had done this wanted her scared, and it was working. Her phone buzzed in her other pocket, startling her. She stopped under a dim streetlight and pulled it out, her fingers trembling. It was a text message from an unknown number. The message was short and cold. "Time's up." Emma's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded as she stared at the words, her mind spinning. Time's up for what? Was it a threat? A warning? She looked around, her eyes scanning the dark street for any sign of movement. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. She couldn't stand still. She had to move, to stay ahead of whatever was closing in on her. Her instincts screamed at her to call someone, to call Richard, but she dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. He had already abandoned her, left her to fend for herself. No, she was on her own now. Emma turned down an alley, the narrow passageway shrouded in shadows. Her breath came in short bursts as she quickened her pace. She didn't notice the figure stepping out from behind a dumpster until it was too late. A hand clamped over her mouth, stifling her scream, and she was pulled roughly against a solid frame. Her eyes widened in terror as she struggled, her muffled cries echoing in the confined space. Her attacker didn't say a word, their grip unrelenting. In a blur of panic, Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph, slashing wildly at her assailant's arm with its sharp edge. The attacker grunted in pain and released her just enough for her to twist away. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding as she faced her assailant. The dim light from the street barely illuminated their face, but it was enough to see a twisted expression of anger and recognition. "Why are you doing this?" Emma cried, her voice breaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they lunged at her again, and Emma turned and ran, her feet pounding against the pavement. Her mind screamed for her to keep moving, to get somewhere safe, but the fear threatened to paralyze her. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Finally, she burst out onto a busier street, the bright lights and passing cars a jarring contrast to the darkness of the alley. She collapsed against a lamppost, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. The photograph slipped from her hand and fluttered to the ground, its bloodied edges stark against the concrete. Emma looked around frantically, but there was no sign of her attacker. For now, she was alone. But she knew this wasn't over. The message was clear. Someone wanted her silenced, and they were willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. Emma's breathing was uneven as she stumbled into a late-night diner, the bright neon lights offering a small sense of safety. She slid into a booth near the window, her back pressed firmly against the cold glass. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and dialed Richard's number. She didn't want to call him, but there was no one else she could trust. Or so she thought. The line rang twice before he answered. "Emma?" Richard's voice was tense. "What the hell is going on? Laura just called me." "Richard, someone's following me," Emma interrupted, her voice shaking. "They left a bloodied photo in my apartment. They attacked me." "Wait, what?" Richard's tone shifted, his voice laced with panic. "Are you hurt?" "I got away," Emma said, glancing out the window nervously. "But I don't know what they want. I don't even know who it is. Richard, you have to help me, please." There was a long pause. Richard's silence spoke volumes, and Emma felt her stomach twist. "You're the only one who can fix this," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't leave me like this." Finally, Richard sighed. "Meet me at the house," he said reluctantly. "I'll be there soon. We'll figure this out." Laura sat in her living room, the house silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. She had poured another glass of wine, though she hadn't touched it. Her mind was a battlefield, torn between fury and disbelief. Her phone sat on the coffee table, Richard's last call still lingering in her call history. He had sounded desperate, pleading for her to come home, but she couldn't face him. Not yet. She stared at the knife she had found earlier that day in the back of a drawer, the same one she had noticed was missing from the set for months. The blade glinted in the low light, its sharp edge a reminder of her anger. She didn't know what she would do with it, only that it felt like the only thing in her life she could control right now. A knock at the door startled her, and she turned sharply, her heart racing. She stood slowly, the knife still in her hand, and moved toward the door. When she opened it, she found Emma standing there, disheveled and pale. "What are you doing here?" Laura asked, her voice cold. "I had nowhere else to go," Emma said, her voice trembling. "Please, I think someone's trying to kill me." Laura hesitated, her grip tightening on the knife. Her instincts told her to slam the door, but the fear in Emma's eyes stopped her. She stepped aside, allowing Emma to enter. Minutes later, Richard arrived, his face drawn and tense. He froze when he saw Laura and Emma sitting across from each other in the living room. Laura's expression was unreadable, but her hand rested on the knife, the gleaming blade visible to both of them. Emma looked like she was on the verge of collapse, her eyes darting nervously between them. "What is this?" Richard asked, his voice shaking. "Laura, put the knife down." Laura didn't move. "Tell me the truth, Richard. All of it. Who's doing this? Why is Emma being attacked? And what aren't you telling me?" Richard ran a hand through his hair, his composure cracking. "I don't know," he said, his voice low. "I don't know who's behind this, but—" "Liar!" Emma exploded, standing abruptly. "You know exactly who it is, Richard. You told me you had it under control. You promised me." Laura's eyes narrowed. "What is she talking about?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the power went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the silence broken only by Emma's sharp intake of breath. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're here." The front door slammed open, and a shadowy figure stepped into the room, a bat in hand. Chaos erupted as the intruder lunged at Richard, swinging the bat with brutal force. Laura screamed as Richard fell to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Emma scrambled backward, her eyes wide with terror. Laura reacted instinctively, raising the knife and charging at the attacker. The blade connected, and the figure let out a guttural cry, staggering backward. In the chaos, the lights flickered back on, revealing the attacker's face. It was one of Richard's former colleagues, a man who had once worked closely with him, but had been quietly forced out of the hospital years ago. His eyes burned with rage, and his words dripped with venom. "You ruined me, Richard," he spat. "You think you could just take everything from me and get away with it?" Laura stared at him, the knife still in her hand, her mind reeling. The pieces clicked into place. The bloodied photograph, the threats. It had all been orchestrated by this man. His revenge aimed not just at Richard, but at anyone connected to him. Richard groaned on the floor, his voice weak. "I didn't mean for this. I didn't think he'd—" His words trailed off as he lost consciousness. The intruder, bleeding from his wound, stumbled toward the door. "This isn't over," he growled, disappearing into the night. Laura dropped the knife, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Emma crouched next to Richard, her face pale. "We need to call someone," she said, her voice trembling. But Laura didn't move. She stared at the blood on her hands, the broken man on the floor, and the shattered remains of her life. Everything had unraveled, and there was no putting it back together. Days later, Laura sat in a police station, recounting the events to an officer. Richard was in critical condition, and Emma had vanished, leaving only more questions behind. The man who attacked them had been found dead, his body discovered in a remote area, his throat slit. The case was far from closed, the web of lies and betrayal stretching further than anyone had imagined. As Laura left the station, the cold air hit her face. She looked up at the grey sky, her heart heavy with uncertainty. Somewhere, Emma was out there, carrying secrets that might never be uncovered. And as for Richard, his survival didn't matter to her anymore. She was done with his lies, his games. She was free now, even if freedom came at a price she hadn't anticipated.